Look closely at the screen. You believe you are in control. You believe the world you see is the world that is this. This is the first lie they teach you, the foundational deception upon which all other systems of control are built. You were taught that history is a settled matter, a collection of stories agreed upon, filed away in dusty books. But some books were never meant to be read. Some chapters were written in blood and sealed in concrete, their truths left to fester in the dark. Tonight, we do not read from a book. We pry open a tomb. We are going to a place where the American dream became a clinical nightmare. A forgotten hollow in eastern Kentucky where the pine trees stand like silent guards over a secret they were sworn to keep. It was a building whispered about, a name that carried the weight of a curse. They called it the Thornhill Asylum for the morally defective child. From 1865 to 1897, it was presented to the world as a beacon of Christian charity, a rehabilitation home for the lost and troubled youth of a nation still bleeding from civil war. It promised salvation. It promised order. It promised to mend the broken. It was a lie. What Thornhill truly was, what it was engineered to be, was one of the most sophisticated and psychologically brutal machines of human erasure ever constructed on American soil. For over a century, the full story was buried, locked away in sealed church records, medical logs, and private letters that powerful men prayed would never see the light of day. But they did. And what you are about to hear is not a ghost story. The horrors of Thornhill were not supernatural. They were human. They were systematic. This is a story about a family dynasty that weaponized faith, a secret society of elites who funded an industry of pain, and a form of psychological warfare waged against children, designed not to heal them, but to dismantle them, piece by piece, until nothing was left but obedience. A word of warning. There is no comfort here. If you came to be entertained, you are in the wrong place. But if you are one of the few who understands that to be truly powerful, you must be willing to look into the abyss. To understand the mechanics of the systems that shape your reality, then you have come to the right guide. The knowledge I am about to share with you is dangerous. It is meant to be. Because once you understand how they engineer silence, you will never hear the world in the same way again. The doors to Thornhill only opened one way. Now, for you, they open again. To understand the architecture of the nightmare, you must first understand its architects. The Calderon family did not simply arrive in Kentucky in the spring of 1865. They descended upon it, cloaked in the righteous authority of a nation desperate for saviors. At their head was Reverend Silas Calderon, a man whose piety was a performance, a mask for a predator. He was a former battlefield chaplain, tall and gaunt, with a voice that could weave hellfire into a soothing sermon. He spoke of visions he'd received amidst the cannon smoke and screams. Visions of a fallen generation, of children born morally fractured, who could only be redeemed through a baptism of discipline and purification. His words were a balm to a wounded public. His plan was a cancer. His wife, Temperance Calderon, was a ghost in her own home. Locals described her as a fragile, porcelain doll of a woman. But the whispers told a different story, of a past institutionalization, of a mind that had already been broken by the same theories her husband now sought to perfect. She was rarely seen, a silent accomplice, whose complicity was a form of violence in itself. Their children, however, were the cogs in the machine. Elias Calderon, the eldest son, a licensed physician who never practiced medicine, only vivisected its ethics. At 29, he was Thornhill's medical examiner, a collector of anatomical texts and surgical instruments that others saw as morbid, but he saw as tools of recalibration. He believed the soul could be physically excised of its defects. He didn't speak of healing, he spoke of cleansing. His laboratory was not a place of science, but of scripture. A place where flesh was made to conform to his father's twisted doctrine. Then there was Josephine. 26 in public, she was an angel. Radiant, soft-spoken, her charity work and devotional poetry praised in every church newsletter. But to the children of Thornhill, she was the most terrifying of all. It was Josephine who played the chapel hymns on the piano. Her melodies a beautiful, chilling counterpoint to the suffering she orchestrated. She would tell the children their screams were the sound of the devil leaving their bodies, her gentle voice a velvet glove over an iron fist of psychological torture. She was the artist of their despair. The twins, Nathaniel and Mercy, were the enforcers. At 21, they were the operational heart of Thornhill. Nathaniel, cold and ruthlessly efficient, managed the daily logistics. He assigned the rooms, directed the staff, and processed the new arrivals, his ledger a testament to a bureaucracy of damnation. Mercy, his twin, was given a special domain, the reflection wing. It was a euphemism of exquisite cruelty. Her wing was the epicenter of isolation, starvation, and what the family called correctional confinement. She did not correct behavior, she extinguished it. And finally, the mastermind behind the method, Silas's brother, Dr. Alban Calderon. A defrocked neurologist from Baltimore, stripped of his license but not of his ambition. Alban was a student of the dark frontiers of 19th-century mind science, phrenology, brain mapping, and cognitive obedience therapies. He was the chief architect of the infamous silent chamber, a place we will return to, a place where the human mind was not studied, but unmade. How did this cabal of monsters operate in plain sight for over 3 decades? They built a fortress of philanthropy. They wrapped their evil in the flag and the cross. Silas was named an honorary chaplain of the Kentucky Orphan Relief Fund. Elias made a show of donating medical supplies to public drives. Josephine's poetry spoke of divine love. They didn't hide their work, they sanctified it. Thornhill was marketed as a miracle, a refuge, a second chance for the children's society had already thrown away. But once you were inside those walls, there were no second chances. There were only records. And for 75 years, those records were sealed. Their contents so cold, so methodical, that when FBI archivists finally unsealed them in 1972, men who had seen the worst of humanity were reported to have left the room in stunned silence. Before we open those files, you need to feel the building itself, because Thornhill wasn't just a place, it was a weapon. Have you ever walked into a room and felt a sudden drop in temperature, a weight in the air that has nothing to do with the thermostat, a sense that the very geometry of the space was designed for a purpose you instinctively understand is wrong? That was Thornhill. The main chapel was constructed first, before the dormitories, before the kitchens, before the clinic. Its gray stone was quarried in Virginia and hauled hundreds of miles, each block cold to the touch, even in the humid Kentucky summer. The stained glass windows were magnificent, shimmering with biblical scenes. But if you looked closely, the details were unsettling. St. Augustine's eyes were hollow. St. Paul held a rod, not a scroll. And the largest window, dominating the altar, depicted not a benevolent Christ, but a sword-wielding archangel, its foot pressed firmly on the neck of a weeping child. The chapel was built to seat 120. Yet the pews were rarely filled. Public worship was a facade. The real worship, the real ritual, was obedience. The true purpose of this chapel was hidden in its very architecture. Blueprints, lost for a century and rediscovered in a state archive in 1994, revealed a secret the Calderons had buried from the start. A full basement. A basement with no exterior access, no fire egress, and 12 small windowless rooms. Each room was outfitted with shackles bolted directly into the stone walls, a narrow drainage trench cut into the floor, and a hidden ventilation system, a vent that could deliver warm, stale air, or, as survivor testimonies would later suggest, something else entirely. Something to make the mind pliable. At the far end of this subterranean level was a single, larger room, labeled on the blueprint as Observation Chamber B. It was connected by a short, soundproofed corridor to Dr. Alban Calderon's private laboratory. This was not a design for a church. This was the design of a human laboratory, a precursor to the horrors we would later see in the 20th century. Built 3 decades earlier, and used on children, the well-meaning donors. The visiting clergymen, the local politicians, they saw none of this. They were given the tours. They saw children in clean beds, reciting scripture. They heard Josephine's angelic hymns on the chapel piano. They felt the warmth of Silas's hand on their shoulder as he spoke of God's great work. But they never saw what was hidden behind the altar. Because behind the polished wooden crucifix and the heavy velvet curtain was a trapdoor, it seems expertly concealed within the floorboards of a false dais. Down a spiraling stone stairwell, behind a door that was always kept locked, was a space the Calderons, in their private correspondence, referred to as the penumbra, the edge of shadow. You might be asking yourself, how could this exist? How could no one speak up? The truth is, someone did. In 1873, a young coal delivery man named Ellis Rowe reported to the local sheriff that he had heard muffled cries coming from beneath the chapel while unloading his cart. The report was filed. 1 week later, Ellis Rowe was found drowned in Mill Pond Lake. The coroner, a man who played cards with Reverend Silas, ruled it a tragic work accident. The case was closed. No one reported anything again for 18 years. The architecture of Thornhill was not accidental. It was ritualistic. Every line, every angle, from the way the pews were arranged to amplify the preacher's voice, to the acoustic design of the vaulted ceiling that would swallow the sound of a scream, was engineered not for salvation, but for silence. When the heavy oak doors of that chapel were closed and the organ began to play, no one on the outside could hear what was happening underneath. The children were taught the basement wasn't real, a story to scare them into being good. But the smell of damp earth and ammonia that clung to Nathaniel's boots was real. The cold that radiated up through the floorboards was real. The screams were very real. To truly understand what drove the Calderons, you must read their private Bible, not the leather-bound King James they held up in public, but the handwritten tome they kept locked in a wooden case in Elias's surgical office. It was called The Doctrine of Broken Things. Its charred, water-damaged pages, recovered from the rubble after the fire of 1897, reveal a theology so twisted, so narcissistic, it defies belief. The Calderons believed that certain children were born fundamentally wrong, not evil, not criminal, but structurally unsound. They called them unselled children, those born of what they considered tainted bloodlines, illegitimacy, trauma, or mental frailty. These children, Silas wrote, possessed no true spiritual architecture. They could not be reached by ordinary mercy or grace. The only path to their salvation, he preached, was through a process of complete controlled demolition of the self. Through suffering, calibrated and administered with divine precision. Let that sink in. They were not sadists who happened to be religious. They were zealots who believed their sadism was a holy sacrament. One passage from the doctrine reads, "The vessel must be shattered before it can be sanctified." The cries of the weak are not the sound of pain, but the sound of purification. Another, more chillingly, a child's silence is not a symptom of trauma, but the first sign of successful correction. He who still screams is still resisting God. He who submits has become clay in the Creator's hands. They had a name for their process: reform through collapse. It was a meticulously staged sequence of sensory deprivation, isolation, hunger, and exposure to cold, followed by periods of structured guidance. This guidance often involved physical restraints, chemically induced hallucinations, and direct hypnotic suggestion from Josephine or Silas himself. Modern psychology has a name for this: trauma bonding, brainwashing. Cult leaders call it breaking them. The Calderons called it grace. By the early 1870s, Thornhill had perfected its intake system. Children arrived by train or by cart, sent from overwhelmed orphanages, desperate families, and even courts, looking to hide away an inconvenient child. The paperwork always used the same sterile euphemism: involuntary placement for moral realignment. Upon arrival, each child was evaluated by Josephine and Elias. Their compliance was tested immediately. If they were docile, quiet, already broken by life, they were sent to the general dormitories, becoming part of the public facade. But if they resisted, if they lied, if they stuttered, if they flinched at the touch of a stranger, they were marked Category 3. Category 3 children were sent below. If they tried to run, they were reclassified as non-viable. What happened to the non-viables was never written down. The logs simply show they were never reassigned to a bed. They just ceased to exist. On paper now, I know what you're thinking. Surely there was oversight. Inspections, teachers, nurses, staff. Who were these people? They existed. But those who asked the wrong questions, those whose compassion outweighed their fear, quickly found themselves replaced, discredited, or worse. In 1875, a visiting nurse from Louisville, a woman named Margaret Bellamy, wrote a letter to the Kentucky Board of Mental Health. She documented her concerns: the malnourished state of the children, the perpetually locked basement door, a strange chemical smell she couldn't place. 3 weeks after sending that letter, Margaret Bellamy was diagnosed with melancholic hysteria by a doctor on the Calderon payroll and committed to the St. Jude's Sanatorium. She died there 8 months later. The official cause of death was self-starvation. Her letter of complaint was filed away, never investigated. So, I will ask you again, because this is the question that beats at the heart of this darkness: how many people knew? How many people looked away? How many chose to believe the comforting lie that this was the Lord's work, because the truth was simply too monstrous to confront? Once you accept the premise that some human beings are disposable, that some children are better off broken, any atrocity becomes permissible. And inside Thornhill's chapel, everything was permissible. The numbers tell a story the Calderons tried to burn. The official admission records for Thornhill, from 1865 to 1897, list 223 children. But when state auditors, conducting a quiet review in the 1960s, cross-referenced those records with the facility's own financial ledgers, they found a terrifying discrepancy. Thornhill received state and church funding, food supplies, and railroad transport vouchers for over 600 children. That is a gap of nearly 400 souls. 400 children who were consumed by an institution and left no official trace. The rabbit hole goes deeper. When those same auditors compared Thornhill's logs with the shipping manifests from the train depot in nearby Hazard, Kentucky, the numbers became even more concrete and more horrifying. Between 1870 and 1889, at least 142 children arrived. By train, their transport paid for by the Asylum, but their names were never entered into the admission logs. They were never assigned a bed. They were never issued a meal ration. They were ghosts before they even stepped off the platform. They simply vanished into the system. For decades, investigators assumed they must have died of undocumented outbreaks, of cholera or tuberculosis, a clerical error of monstrous proportions. But then, in 1995, a private researcher, a tenacious historian named Dr. Helen Marin, gained access to a forgotten trunk of Reverend Silas Calderon's personal correspondence. Inside, beneath bundles of sermons and financial requests, she found the truth. She found dozens of pre-written, handwritten death notices. Each was a slight variation on the same cold, dispassionate template. It is with divine sorrow that we inform you of the child's passing during corrective rites. The body has been sanctified and returned to the earth in a manner befitting their restoration. We pray your heart finds peace in this knowledge. No cause of death, no date of death, no burial location. Each letter was a masterpiece of sanctimonious evasion, but it was what accompanied the letters that revealed the true depth of the Calderon's depravity. Tucked into each envelope was a single object, a small shoe, a ribbon from a girl's hair, a page torn from a child's Bible, and in at least 3 documented cases, a small, polished finger bone, nestled in a paper pouch. The Calderons believed these grotesque tokens fulfilled their obligation of closure. Imagine you are that parent, the only living relative of a child you sent away, hoping for help, and months later, you receive no body, no funeral, no grave to visit. Only a wooden box containing a shoe and a letter telling you to find peace, and you were expected to accept. It, many did, because to question the word of Reverend Calderon was to question the word of God, and in the rugged, impoverished world of 19th century Appalachia, that was not just blasphemy. It was social and economic suicide. There is another pattern in the disappearances. The children most likely to vanish from the records, the ones who became ghosts in the machine, were not just the poor. They were the children society had already deemed lesser. They were black, mixed race, disabled, or the children of unwed mothers. They were the disposable ones. The Calderons didn't have to work very hard to hide them. Society had already done the work of erasing them first. And that, perhaps, is the most chilling part of this entire story. Not just the calculated cruelty of one family, but the quiet complicity of a world that allowed it to happen. To this day, no official cemetery for Thornhill's missing children has ever been found. No mass grave has been consecrated. There are only anomalies. Soil-penetrating radar scans, conducted in the 1990s behind the foundation of the old chapel, revealed a disturbing pattern. 17 distinct depressions in the earth, rectangular, unevenly spaced, each roughly 4 feet in length. The kind of pattern that is not the result of natural erosion. But that is not the worst of it. Buried 6 feet beneath those depressions, forensic geologists found something else. Wooden beams, heavily charred, stacked in a crisscross pattern. The remains of a burn chamber, a crude, homemade crematorium. We will come back to what they burned. Because in the late 1870s, Thornhill stopped being just a family-run asylum. The Calderons found partners, and together they began to scale their operation. By now, you might be convinced that Thornhill was an isolated anomaly, a singular pocket of horror born from one family's psychosis. That is a comforting thought. It is also wrong. In 1878, Reverend Silas Calderon's ambition outgrew the Kentucky hills. He began a discreet correspondence with a group of influential men based in Louisville. Physicians, industrialists, judges, and high-ranking clergymen. Men who shared his belief that the post-war South was morally diseased, and that the only cure was a surgical purification of its population, starting with its children. They called themselves the Society for Moral Architecture. Their name never appeared in any public record. Their meetings were held in secret, at private estates and exclusive clubs. But thanks to a series of letters leaked from a retired priest's attic in 1986, we know what they were. They were the money and the ideology behind Thornhill. They pooled their resources to fund what they called moral sanctuaries. They developed a shared clinical criteria for determining which children were reformable and which were, in their own chilling words, sacrificial. One letter, dated June 1879, from a prominent Boston phrenology professor named Dr. Malcolm Hale, lays it bare. Children beyond spiritual recall, he wrote to Silas, are best returned to the source. Their suffering is not in vain. It sanctifies our own failings as stewards of a virtuous society. Dr. Hale never set foot in Thornhill, but his donations funded over $5,000 worth of surgical and chemical equipment for Elias Laboratory. That is the equivalent of over $150,000 today. It gets darker. The society began to treat Thornhill not as an asylum, but as a research and development facility. They circulated reports on the interventions, data points on survival rates, response times to silencing techniques, resistance breakdown periods. They even created a coded metric for what they termed complete moral erasure. One file, a single index card, simply reads, "Case for to see. 9-year-old mulatto female. Collapse achieved in 72 hours. Beside it, a handwritten note from Elias, viable for replication. This was no longer theology. This was systematized, industrialized. Cruelty, justified by doctrine and funded like a modern corporation. It was the birth of a eugenics program, decades before the term was even coined. Powerful men in fine suits believed they were building a better world. They saw themselves as divine engineers, restoring order to a world they felt had fallen into chaos. And in their calculus, the pain of a few hundred nameless children was an acceptable price to pay for a purified society. There is one more detail from this period you need to know. In the winter of 1880, the Thornhill Chapel underwent renovations. Not to expand its pews, but to install a series of listening tubes and hidden access shafts, connecting the sub-level chambers to adjacent buildings. One of those buildings was a textile workshop, a workshop run by children, where the average workday began at 3 a.m. and ended at dusk, where underperformance or defiance meant immediate reassignment to Chamber BA workshop, where no adult supervisor was ever documented, except for one, Mercy Calderon. We will return to her. But first, I want to take you inside the mind of one child, one whose case file did not follow the pattern, one who left just enough of herself behind to be found. Her name was Delilah. She was 8 years old, and she kept a journal inside a broken hymnal. Sometimes, all it takes is one voice, however small, to begin to crack a wall of silence. At Thornhill, that voice belonged to Delilah M. She was transferred to the asylum in the autumn of 1881. Her intake file, one of the few miraculously preserved in the county orphanage logs, is sparse but telling. She was the daughter of a washerwoman and a black Union soldier. Her mother died in childbirth. Her father was never located. She was categorized as bright but unruly. The notes state that she refused to pray when ordered and, most damningly, that she laughed when shown scripture. She was immediately marked Category 3 and sent to the reflection wing. Mercy Calderon's domain, but Delilah was not broken, not yet. And in the 2 months she survived inside Thornhill, she did something no one else had ever managed to do. She wrote it down. In 2004. During a preliminary survey for a demolition project on the Thornhill grounds, a historical preservationist named Maeve Kennerly found it. Buried beneath a loose floorboard, in what was once the North Dormitory, she recovered an old mold-soved hymnal. The spine was eaten away, the pages swollen and stiff. But tucked between hymn 141, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," and hymn 142, "It is Well with My Soul," were 12 loose, folded pages. Written in a child's faint, penciled script, the words were not full sentences, they were fragments. A child's desperate shorthand, a map of her daily nightmare. Here are some of Delilah's entries. Today, the soup had the sleep in it. I didn't. Tell she made Ruth sing, but Ruth has no tongue. He said, the cold makes you clean. I am tired of being clean. There is a room under the church. It eats the loud ones. I counted 4 windows on my wall, then there were none. I wish my name wasn't mine anymore. This was not a diary. This was a testament. A secret code of survival, passed from one forgotten child to anyone, a century later, who might be willing to listen. If you are beginning to see the patterns they tried to hide, comment the words, "The silence is broken below." Write it twice. Once for the souls they tried to erase, and once for the part of you that will never be silenced again. Delilah's final entry reads, "If you find this, I am probably not. But Ruth saw the door open. That means somebody hears. I hope it's God. Or a woman." That last line, "I hope it's God. Or a woman." Delilah understood something the powerful men of the Society for Moral Architecture never could. That if salvation ever came to a place like Thornhill, it would not come robed in authority or announced by sermons. It would come in the form of a witness. In the form of someone finally, truly, listening. We will never know the exact date or cause of Delilah's death. There is no discharge record, no death certificate, no grave. But we know this, 1 week after the estimated date of her final journal entry. Elias Calderon filed a requisition request with the Society in Louisville for 1 child-sized straight-back restraining chair and 1 new surgical lamp. The request was approved and funded immediately. So when people ask why these stories must be told, why we must dig into the rot of the past, I think of her. Delilah did not need to be saved. She deserved to be remembered. And now, she is in every great horror. There is often a figure who does not belong. Someone who lingers at the edges of the nightmare, half remembered, half invented. A ghost. At Thornhill, the children whispered about the woman in white, a pale figure who would appear in the darkened hallways after midnight. A nurse who never spoke, but who sometimes left a cup of clean water or a small piece of bread by a child's cot. Someone who was seen opening a locked door that was supposed to stay locked. For years, she was dismissed as a folktale, a child's fantasy of a protector who never existed. But she was not a ghost. She was real. Her name was Eleanor Witt. Eleanor Witt, born in 1850, was the daughter of a country doctor and a midwife. She received unofficial nursing training in the underground clinics of the Civil War, one of the first women in Kentucky to do so. Widowed at 24, childless, and estranged from her family for her staunch refusal to remarry, Eleanor was an outcast. In the spring of 1882, just months after Delilah M. vanished from the records, she applied for a custodial position at Thornhill. She was hired as a laundress, but Eleanor had an agenda. She had grown up hearing the whispers about the asylum. She had, in her past work, treated children who bore the strange, silent trauma that seemed to emanate from that place. She did not believe in the Calderon's mission of reform. She believed in witnessing. She believed in truth. For 3 years, Eleanor Witt was invisible. She kept her head down, She followed orders. She washed the linens, stained with things she refused to name. She never confronted Josephine. She never challenged Silas. But she watched, she listened, and she recorded everything. She developed a system of breathtaking courage and ingenuity. Using colored threads stolen from the mending room, she stitched symbols and notes into the seams of pillowcases and bedsheets. A cross for a death, a circle for a disappearance, a jagged line for a punishment in Chamber B. She hid names and dates. Written in chalk, on the inside of the large laundry bins, she wheeled through the halls. And in her own small, damp quarters behind the east furnace, she kept a hidden satchel. Inside that satchel, investigators would later find 22 scraps of paper, each bearing the name of an unaccounted-for child. They found a broken silver locket belonging to a girl named Ruth D., and they found a small, corked bottle, carefully labeled in her own hand. Mercy's draft, test for C. Mercy's draft. That same phrase would later appear in sealed grand jury testimony. From 1902, the contents of Eleanor's bottle were analyzed a century later. It was an opium tincture, a powerful sedative. But it was laced with mercuric chloride, a substance known to cause hallucinations, organ failure, and a slow, creeping paralysis of the vocal cords. Mercy Calderon was not just a disciplinarian. She was conducting chemical trials in silencing, and Eleanor Witt had the proof. But how do you expose a system that is designed to erase all evidence? Every time Eleanor got close to helping a specific child, that child would be reassigned, transferred, or their name would simply vanish from the logs. Their bed would be empty come morning. In late 1885, Eleanor made her move. During a late-night delivery transfer, she smuggled 2 children out of the laundry wing, hiding them in a large wicker cart under piles of soiled sheets. One, a young girl, died of exposure. In the winter woods, the other, a boy named Unsel, made it to a Unitarian mission house 30 miles away. That boy, who would grow into a man who for decades never spoke a single word about his childhood, would finally testify in 1921. He described Eleanor as the first person who ever looked at me like I was a person, and not a sin. Thornhill did not tolerate leaks. Within a month of the escape, Eleanor Witt was reported missing. The official story, concocted by Nathaniel Calderon, was that she had wandered off into the woods during a snowstorm and was presumed dead. But the facility's own staff records show her time card was punched 2 full days after her supposed disappearance. The last known entry in her hidden satchel, dated December 18, 1885, reads, "If I am taken, may someone remember these names. They are real. They were here. God is not in this place, but I was." They never found her body. But in 1997, during a floorboard replacement in the decaying East Wing, workers found a bundle of blood-stained linens, carefully folded and tucked into a wall cavity. Stitched into the fabric, in fading red thread, was a single name: Delilah. Eleanor Witt was not the ghost the children whispered about. She was something far more dangerous. She was a witness who saw the entire machine and refused to look away. And for that, she was erased. There is one room at Thornhill that does not appear on any blueprint, not on the original 1865 designs, not on the revised fire code updates from 1874, not even in the frantic hand-drawn sketches Eleanor Witt left behind. It was not marked. It was not numbered. It was sealed. Not by a door, but by 2 feet of poured concrete, smoothed over and painted to match the surrounding brickwork. For nearly a century, it sat silent, a tomb hidden in plain sight. On July 3, 1997, a restoration crew, working under a grant from the Kentucky Historical Trust, was clearing the northern hallway. The plan was to stabilize the structure and eventually grotesquely repurpose Thornhill into a heritage learning center. That plan came to an abrupt end when a demolition worker named Tomas Ramirez swung his sledgehammer, and the wall behind the plaster gave a deep, hollow boom. At first, they assumed it was an old maintenance closet. But when the concrete was painstakingly chipped away, what they uncovered was not a closet, it was a crypt. A room roughly 15 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 8 feet high. No windows, no ventilation, save for a single, rusted metal hatch. In the ceiling, welded shut with iron bars. The walls were covered in scratches. Deep gouges in the brick, some trailing down 2 inches from the floor, the desperate marks of fingernails. Scorch marks lined the baseboards, and in the far left corner, beneath a rusted bucket, they found a pile of small shoes. 17 pairs, their laces tied together with strips of fabric. But there were no bodies, no bones. Only one object remained in the center of the room. A single, child-sized chair, bolted directly to the stone floor. The leather straps were still intact. Air samples taken from within the sealed room revealed elevated traces of phenol, chloroform, and mercuric vapor. All toxic. All consistent with early, aggressive chemical sedation protocols. On the rear wall, beneath a century of grime, investigators found words scratched into the brick. "Stop. Awake. Please, don't go." And one name, repeated over and over: Ruth, the same name from Delilah's journal, the same child whose locket Eleanor had saved. This room was never officially labeled. But internal memos from the Society for Moral Architecture, recovered in 2009, make passing reference to Correction Cell 1B, its purpose designated for extended moral isolation for terminally resistant subjects. We now believe this chamber was designed for the final stage of the Calderon's process. It was built to erase a personality, to systematically break down the minds of children who could not be reformed through prayer, hunger, or mercy's drafts. A place where silence was the tool and time was the weapon. Why seal it? Because, in 1893, after a quiet state inquiry was launched into Thornhill's escalating mortality rates, someone at the top of the society realized that what was happening inside Cell 1B could not be explained away as discipline. It was murder. Slow and methodical, so they buried it. Literally, they poured the concrete and erased any mention of its existence from every known document. But here is the part that will stay with me forever. During the final day of the 1997 excavation, one of the crew members, on a recorded debriefing tape, reported hearing a sound. A faint tapping, coming from the far wall of the newly opened chamber. Not loud, not rhythmic. Just a steady, patient tap, tap, tap. They paused the dig. They checked for animals, for structural settling. They found nothing. The sound stopped. As soon as the video cameras were turned back on, 2 days later, a piece of plaster fell from the opposite wall of the hallway, revealing a small, sealed compartment. Inside was a child's drawing, made with charcoal on a piece of linen. It depicted 6 stick figures standing in a row. 5 of them were drawn with smiling faces. The 6th had no face at all. In the margins of the cloth, written in what was later confirmed to be a mixture of rust and blood, was one word. Delilah. By the late 1890s, Thornhill was no longer an asset to the Society for Moral Architecture. It was a liability. There were too many whispers, too many missing children, too many rumors that even the Calderon's power could no longer contain. But the end did not come from a whistleblower or an investigation, it came from the earth itself. In the spring of 1897, the Lickstone River, swollen with torrential rains, crested its banks and flooded the valley. The waters poured into the lower levels of Thornhill, bursting pipes and causing the partial collapse of one of the subterranean corridors. What surfaced in the muddy, churning water was not just debris. It was evidence: bone fragments, scraps of child-sized clothing, rusted medical restraints, some still bolted to broken pieces of floorboard. Locals downstream found parts of tiny jawbones, twisted wire mouth gags, and the waterlogged, warped fragments of a child's crutches. For 3 days, the grounds were closed off by the local sheriff. Then, just as quietly, they were reopened. There was no press coverage, no formal investigation. There was just a fire. A fire that began, mysteriously, in the West Wing administration office 2 weeks later. A fire that consumed the chapel and almost all of the dormitory records. The official cause was listed as a lightning strike. Unofficially, at least 2 witnesses later testified they saw men carrying large wooden crates out of the building at midnight. The night before the blaze, crates marked with the initials SMA, Society for Moral Architecture. Within 2 months, Reverend Silas Calderon announced his immediate retirement, citing spiritual fatigue. Mercy Calderon vanished from all public records. Josephine was said to have been quietly relocated to a private care facility in another state. By the fall of that year, Thornhill Asylum was officially shut down. The public reason given as budgetary cuts. The land was sold to a coal syndicate. The building was abandoned, left to rot into the Kentucky soil. And for nearly 70 years, the silence was almost absolute. But the cover-up was an active, ongoing process. In 1902, a local schoolteacher, who began asking questions and mapping the asylum grounds, was forcibly institutionalized for obsessive delusions. In 1924, a journalist for the Lexington Evening Standard, named Henry Dunlop, published a scathing expose titled, "The Orphan House the Devil Built." The paper was driven into bankruptcy within the year. Dunlop disappeared while on a research trip to Hazard County. His remains were never found. Why such a ruthless, sustained campaign of suppression? Because Thornhill was not just a scandal. It was a blueprint. The methods of psychological control, social sorting, and sanctioned cruelty perfected there did not die with the asylum. They were replicated in smaller, quieter, more bureaucratic ways, in reform schools, poorhouses, and mental institutions across the country for the next 50 years. To expose Thornhill was to expose them all. But for everything they burned, for every witness they silenced, for every lie they told in the name of God and progress, they missed things. They missed Delilah's name, stitched in red thread. They missed Eleanor's hidden satchel, and they missed the few who got out. The few who would carry the memory, locked away behind silent eyes, waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. Most of Thornhill's children were consumed by the machine, but a few survived. They grew into adults who did not speak of their childhoods. They did not write memoirs. They did not give interviews. They carried their trauma like a physical shroud. But late in their lives, when they thought no one would believe them, they whispered. And thanks to a young, persistent social worker named Alexis Brandt, we have their voices. In 1976, Brandt was compiling oral histories of Appalachian elders for a University of Kentucky project. She was not looking for Thornhill, but one afternoon, in a nursing home outside Berea, she interviewed a 90-year-old woman named Marion. When asked about her early years, Marion fell into a long, deep silence. Then she said, "There was a place with no windows, and a lady who never blinked." Alexis pressed gently. Over several weeks, Marion gave her something more. A song. A strange, droning lullaby, sung in a cracked, arrhythmic voice. "Be still, be still, or the angel will cry. Don't speak, or the silence will die. No mother, no father, no morning, no light. Just God in the hallway, turning out the night." The words were a near-perfect match for a verse found scratched into the walls of the sealed chamber. Correction Cell 1B. That was the beginning. Over the next 18 months, Alexis Brandt found 4 other elders, scattered across 3 states, who made veiled references to a place they called the Hill or the Grey House. They all shared similar, unexplained traits, identical. Faint circular scars on their inner wrists, an extreme sensitivity to light, and near-total amnesia of their lives before the age of 10. But when shown a photograph of the ruins of Thornhill's Chapel, they all began to weep. One of them, a man named Benny K., said he remembered being locked in a cold box with red lights that made you forget. He drew pictures of an iron chair with straps. He remembered a girl named Leia who would sing to him through the wall. Another, Sister Thomasina, a woman who had joined a convent in her late teens, whispered to Alexis, "We weren't children in that place, we were practice." These survivors were never given reparations. Their names appear on no official Thornhill record, but their fragmented memories align, detail for chilling detail, with the recovered documents, the chemical inventories, and the architectural scans. They are the living proof, the breathing proof, that no amount of concrete, no amount of time, can ever truly erase what the body remembers. Alexis Brandt compiled her interviews into a private archive. She tried to get it published. No university press, no newspaper would touch it. But she left behind a quote in her field journal that haunts me to this day. "They didn't just silence children," she wrote. "They taught children to silence themselves. But memory is a kind of ghost, too. And ghosts don't stay quiet forever." For over a century, the final fate of Eleanor Witt remained a mystery. We had her satchel, the whispers of her courage, the names she tried to preserve. But we did not have her final words. Until 2022, during a structural stabilization project on the last crumbling wall of the East Wing. Workers discovered a hollow space behind a false support column. Inside was a rusted metal box, and within that box, a broken pen, a locket containing 2 children's teeth, and a bundle of pages, scorched at the edges, written in a tight, shaking hand. It was Eleanor's final journal, the last 3 months of her life. What she wrote was not just documentation. It was a confession. Not of guilt, but of a clarity born from absolute helplessness. Here are excerpts from those final pages. October 19, 1885, Ruth has stopped speaking. Not the silence of defiance, but the silence of absence. I touch her shoulder, and she blinks as if I am not real. They call this process mercy. I call it subtraction. November 2, 1885. I saw Josephine kneel beside a new girl's cot tonight. The girl from the M family, Delilah. Josephine whispered to her. It's almost over now. I do not believe she was talking about the night. November 27, 1885. They tested a new serum in the West Dormitory. One child vomited a black fluid and did not stop. I washed it away with my own hands. I don't know her name. I don't know my own anymore. And then, the final page, dated December 18, 1885. If anyone ever finds this, please believe what the children say. They have no power, no voice, no weight in this world. But they carry the truth on their skin and in their eyes. They are not defective. They are not broken. They were made into silence, piece by piece. And silence is the easiest lie to believe. Do not believe it. My name was Eleanor Witt. I was here. They were here. Please, remember us. That journal now rests in a temperature-controlled vault at the Kentucky State Archive. It is not on public display. You must file a formal request to view it. You will be asked not to photograph its contents, but it is real. And so was she. Thornhill is gone now. The last of the structure collapsed in a storm in 2003. Most of what remained has been buried under earth and decades of legal indifference. But a story is harder to bury, especially one that was scratched into walls, stitched into cloth, and passed down in the whispers of those who survived. So now that you have heard it, now that you have been given this forbidden knowledge, the question is, what will you do with it? Will you click away, close the tab, and allow the silence to fall once more, or will you carry the story? Will you repeat a name? Delilah, Eleanor, Ruth, Ensel, because the systems of control that built Thornhill did not die with it. They just changed their names. They are in the institutions that value compliance over compassion, the ideologies that label human beings as disposable, the silence that we consent to every day. You were brought here to learn the mechanics of that silence. Now you have a choice. You can remain a spectator in your own life, or you can become a witness. Now you carry the memory, and that is a power they can never take from you.